In a single day, she lost everything: her husband, her home, her identity, her future. In ancient Israel, when a man died, his wife inherited nothing, zero. The properties went to the male sons or relatives of the deceased. And her? She depended on the mercy of whoever ended up with the assets she helped build. This was the brutal reality of widows in the Old Testament. To understand the weight of this condition, you first need to understand how the social structure of ancient Israel worked. Society was organized around three fundamental pillars: land, family, and name. Land guaranteed economic survival. Family guaranteed social protection. The name guaranteed identity and generational continuity. When a woman married, she left her father's house and entered her husband's house. She became part of a new family, a new clan, a new patriarchal lineage. Her identity merged completely with that of her spouse. Her children would carry his name. Her physical, economic, and social security depended entirely on his position in the community. Now imagine what happened when that man died. The widow didn't just lose a life companion. She lost her place in the entire system. The land she helped cultivate for 10, 20, 30 years wasn't hers. The flocks she helped care for over decades weren't hers. The house where she raised her children, where she prepared thousands of meals, where she wove clothes and kept the home running, wasn't hers. Absolutely everything belonged to her husband's lineage. And with his death, that lineage had to decide what to do with this woman who now occupied an uncomfortable space in the family structure. If the widow had adult male children, the situation was less desperate. The sons had a moral and religious obligation to care for their mother. But if the children were too young to provide sustenance, or if there were no male children, or if there were only daughters, the widow entered a social limbo that could last the rest of her life. She existed without truly belonging anywhere. The book of Deuteronomy describes a practice called leveret. The word comes from the Latin levir, which means brother-in-law. The law determined that if a man died without leaving children, his brother should marry the widow. The first son of this marriage would be legally considered the son of the deceased, so that his name would not be erased from Israel. The intention was noble: to protect the widow and preserve the family lineage. But the execution depended entirely on the brother-in-law's goodwill, and goodwill was a frequently scarce resource. The case of Tamar, recorded in Genesis chapter 38, exposes the brutal failures of this system. Tamar married Judah's firstborn. Was wicked in the eyes of the Lord, and he died without leaving children. Following the Levirate law, Judah gave his widowed daughter-in-law to his second son, Onan. But Onan didn't want to father a child that wouldn't be considered his own. Every time he lay with Tamar, he spilled his semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. The biblical text is direct. What Onan did displeased the Lord, and he also died. Judah had a third son, Shelah. He promised Tamar that when Shelah grew up and reached the appropriate age for marriage, she would marry him. It seemed like a reasonable solution. The years passed. Shelah grew up, and Judah didn't keep his promise. He deliberately left Tamar waiting indefinitely, trapped in a limbo of permanent widowhood, without a current husband, without a promised future husband, without children, without inheritance, without any prospect of change whatsoever. Tamar spent years wearing widow's clothes in her own father's house. This wasn't an aesthetic choice or an expression of personal mourning. It was a mandatory social marking, a uniform that publicly identified her. Widows in ancient Israel wore specific garments that immediately identified them to any observer. Dark colors, simple fabrics, complete absence of ornaments or jewelry. Anyone who crossed paths with a widow on the street, in the market, or in the fields instantly knew her social condition. This visual identification served two deeply contradictory purposes. On one hand, it signaled that this woman needed special protection and community charity. On the other hand, it permanently marked her as someone on the margins of normal social structure, a woman out of place. An uncomfortable presence that reminded everyone of the fragility of life and human arrangements. Tamar's case had an outcome that has scandalized generations of readers throughout millennia. Tired of waiting for justice that clearly would never come, she devised a risky plan. She removed her widow's clothes, covered her face with a veil, and sat by the side of a road where she knew Judah would pass. Judah, a widower himself at this point in the story, thought she was a cult prostitute and negotiated her services. He lay with her without ever recognizing her. Tamar became pregnant from that single encounter. 3 months later, Judah received news that his daughter-in-law had prostituted herself and was pregnant. His reaction was immediate and brutal. Bring her out and let her be burned, the death penalty by fire. But Tamar had kept evidence. When they brought her out for execution, she sent a message to her father-in-law along with 3 objects: the seal, the cord, and the staff he had left as a guarantee of payment. "I am pregnant by the man to whom these things belong," she declared. "See whose seal, cord, and staff these are." She had risked her own life, facing death by fire, to secure what divine law already guaranteed her, but which men refused to fulfill. Judah's declaration before the evidence is one of the most revealing in the Old Testament. "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." A widow had to disguise herself as a prostitute, risk public execution, and humiliate a patriarch to obtain the justice that the system should have guaranteed automatically. The very man who condemned her acknowledged that she was more right than he was. But not every widow had Tamar's cunning, courage, or opportunity. The vast majority faced a much quieter and much crueler fate. The slow and systematic poverty that consumed years, decades, entire lives. The law of Moses established specific mechanisms to protect widows from absolute hunger. During the grain harvest, landowners were forbidden from harvesting all the way to the extreme corners of their fields. They were forbidden from going back to pick up sheaves that had been forgotten on the ground. They were forbidden from passing twice through the same olive tree, shaking its branches. They were forbidden from harvesting a second time the clusters left on the vines. Whatever remained at the margins, whatever fell during the harvest, whatever escaped the first pass, all of this belonged by right to the poor, the orphans, the foreigners, and the widows. This practice, called gleaning, was the main source of sustenance for many widows in Israel. It wasn't charity in the modern sense of the word. It was a legal right guaranteed by the Torah. The landowners weren't doing a favor by allowing widows to glean. They were fulfilling a religious and civil obligation. The book of Ruth offers the most detailed and moving portrait of how gleaning worked in daily practice. Ruth, a young Moabite widow, arrived in Bethlehem, accompanying her mother-in-law Naomi, also a widow. 2 completely alone women, without men to protect them, without children to support them, without any property, without resources, arriving in a foreign city during the barley harvest season. The first thing Ruth did upon arriving was to ask permission to glean in the fields. She left at dawn, before the sun rose, and worked all day long under intense heat, bent toward the ground, picking up grain by grain the leftovers that workers left behind. Exhausting work, physically brutal, socially humiliating by any standard of the time, but which represented the absolute difference between eating something and going completely hungry. The biblical text mentions an apparently casual detail that reveals much about the real dangers widows faced in the fields. Boaz, the owner of the property where Ruth happened to end up, gave specific and urgent instructions to his male workers. Don't touch her, don't humiliate her, don't constrain her in any way. Let sheaves fall on purpose. from the already bound bundles, so she can gather more easily. And he said to Ruth herself, "Stay close to my female servants, to the other women. Don't go to another field. Don't leave here." The implication of these instructions is disturbingly clear. A young foreign widow, alone, in fields full of male workers far from any supervision, faced risks that went far beyond hunger. Boaz was offering not just facilitated access to food, but concrete physical protection against violence that evidently happened frequently enough to deserve explicit mention. The amount of grain that Ruth managed to gather on that first day of work was impressive by the standards of the time, about an ephah of barley. This is equivalent to approximately 22 liters of dry grain. A regular hired worker would hardly get that much in a full day of labor. Part of this abundance was due to Boaz's direct intervention, who secretly ordered his men to facilitate gleaning by dropping more than normal. But a significant part was due to Ruth's absolutely brutal effort, who worked without stopping from sunrise to sunset, resting only briefly in the shade during the hottest hours. Naomi, upon seeing the extraordinary amount of grain that her daughter-in-law brought home that first night, immediately understood that something out of the ordinary had happened. She asked in which field Ruth had worked, who the owner was, who had shown such generosity. When she heard the name Boaz, Naomi recognized a possibility that would completely change the fate of both women. Boaz was a close relative of Naomi's late husband. This meant he could act as Goel. The Hebrew word Goel, often translated as redeemer or kinsman redeemer, designated an absolutely central figure in the system of protection for widows and vulnerable people in Israel. The Goel had the right and obligation to redeem family properties that had been sold by impoverished relatives, preventing ancestral land from permanently passing to other families. He had the right to avenge the blood of murdered relatives, pursuing the killer to cities of refuge if necessary. And he had the right to marry the widow of a deceased relative who had no children, producing offspring to preserve the name and inheritance of the dead. It was an elaborate social security system based entirely on blood ties and family obligations. When it worked as planned, it offered a genuine safety net for the most vulnerable. When it failed, and it frequently failed, it left widows, orphans, and the impoverished completely helpless with no recourse whatsoever. In Ruth's specific case, the system worked, but not without revealing complications. Boaz, after being approached by Ruth in a night scene loaded with symbolism at the threshing floor, agreed to act as Goel. He was willing to marry the Moabite widow and redeem the property of Elimelech, Ruth's late father-in-law. However, there was a problem. There was another relative with preferential rights, closer in the family line than Boaz. The negotiation took place publicly, at the city gates, before the elders who served as official witnesses. The closer relative initially agreed to redeem the property when he heard it was just about land. Land was an investment. Land had value. But when Boaz explained that redeeming the property mandatorily included marrying Ruth to produce offspring in the name of the deceased, the relative immediately withdrew. His exact words were, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance." Translation: he didn't want to spend resources raising children who would legally belong to another lineage. He didn't want to divide his inheritance with descendants who would carry another name. The widow and her protection were acceptable only as long as they didn't cost anything significant. How many widows in Israel didn't have a Boaz willing to redeem them when the closer relative refused? How many Tamars waited their entire lives for a Shelah who never came, growing old in mourning clothes in their father's house? The prophets of the Old Testament dedicated some of their fiercest denunciations to the shameful treatment given to widows by Israelite society. Isaiah, writing in the 8th century before Christ during the height of the kingdom of Judah, directly accused Israel's leaders of systematically neglecting the cause of widows. The first chapter of his prophetic book lists the specific sins that provoked divine wrath against the nation: hands full of innocent blood, deliberate refusal to seek genuine justice, failure to protect the oppressed, criminal negligence toward orphans, and institutionalized contempt for widows. In the prophetic theology of Israel, the treatment given to the most vulnerable members of society functioned as a direct and infallible thermometer of the spiritual health of the entire nation. A society that abandoned its widows was rotten on the inside, regardless of how many sacrifices it offered at the temple. Jeremiah, prophesying more than a century later during the final years of Jerusalem, was even more specific in his accusations. He denounced the leaders for shedding innocent blood in the streets of the holy city and for systematically oppressing foreigners, orphans, and widows. Ezekiel, prophesying in the Babylonian exile, listed the sins of Jerusalem that had directly resulted in its catastrophic destruction: deliberate profanation of the sacred, contempt for one's own parents, oppression of vulnerable foreigners, systematic mistreatment of defenseless orphans and abandoned widows. Malachi, the last of the writing prophets of the Old Testament, recorded a chilling divine warning. God would personally come as a swift witness against those who exploit workers in their wages, who oppress widows and orphans, who mistreat foreigners. Divine justice would reach the oppressors, even when human justice completely failed. The prophetic pattern is absolutely unmistakable when you examine the texts in sequence. In the shared vision of all the prophets of Israel, a society that abandoned its widows was simultaneously abandoning its sacred covenant with God. There was no possible separation between the two things. But the reality on the ground, in the villages and cities of Israel, was often very different from the thundering exhortations of the prophets. The book of Job, probably one of the oldest texts preserved in the Hebrew Bible, describes specific practices that truly righteous men should avoid at all costs, taking as pledge the widow's ox, her only work tool, leaving widows with absolutely empty hands when they asked for help, exploiting the complete lack of legal protection of widows to steal their scarce possessions. The simple fact that these practices needed to be explicitly condemned in sacred texts indicates that they were common enough to deserve detailed mention. You don't need to prohibit something that nobody does. The Psalms repeat and amplify the same disturbing pattern. Psalm 68 solemnly declares that God is a father to orphans and a defender of widows in his holy dwelling. Psalm 146 affirms that the Lord protects vulnerable foreigners, sustains helpless orphans, and abandoned widows. But the same psalm also darkly warns that the way of the wicked will be overthrown, that wickedness against the weak will not go unpunished forever. The constant, repetitive, almost obsessive need to reaffirm divine protection for widows throughout all biblical literature strongly suggests that human protection failed repeatedly and systematically. When a system works well, you don't need to repeat infinitely that God will intervene where men fail. One of the darkest aspects of widows' condition was their extreme vulnerability in times of war and conflict. When enemy armies invaded the territory, widows were invariably among the first victims. Without husbands or adult sons to physically defend them, without material resources to organize quick escape, without networks of male protection to intercede for them, they faced sexual violence, forced slavery, or summary death. The Book of Lamentations, written in the immediate aftermath of the complete destruction of Jerusalem by Babylonian armies in 586 before Christ, specifically mentions the horrible fate of women in the catastrophe. Women in Zion were systematically violated. Virgins in the cities of Judah suffered the same fate. Princes were hanged by the hands of the conquerors. No respect or mercy was shown to the elders, but even in times of relative peace, Far from invasions and sieges, the typical widow faced a slower and more silent form of social violence, the systematic and relentless erosion of her scarce resources over the years. Without a husband to represent her in commercial negotiations, she was an easy target for dishonest creditors who charged abusive interest rates. Without a visible male protector, she attracted greedy neighbors who gradually invaded her lands. Without a defender in the courts, she suffered from opportunistic relatives who simply took what they wanted. The book of Proverbs, chapter 15, warns that the Lord tears down and destroys the house of the proud arrogant, but keeps firm and intact the property boundaries of the widow. The reference to boundaries is technical and specific. These were the large stones that were placed to officially mark the borders between different properties. Moving these stones during the night to steal land from a neighbor was a serious crime, punishable by divine curse. And lonely widows were preferred targets for this exact type of land fraud because they could hardly prove the change or obtain justice in the courts. The poor widow faced a deep structural problem that no written law, however well-intentioned, could completely solve. She simply had no recognized institutional voice. In the Israelite judicial system of the time, a woman's testimony automatically carried less weight than a man's testimony. In many types of civil and criminal cases, it wasn't even formally accepted as valid evidence. This concretely meant that a widow defrauded by a powerful neighbor or robbed by an influential relative would have extreme difficulty proving her case before the elders. Her solitary word against his rarely prevailed. The system structurally favored whoever had more connections, more resources, more male voices willing to testify. The elders of the city, who functioned as the court of first instance for local disputes, were invariably all men. They were frequently the same men who had commercial interests, family ties, or debts of favor with those accused of exploiting defenseless widows. The realistic chance of a poor widow without connections obtaining genuine justice against a rich and well-connected man in the community was absolutely minimal. She depended entirely on the unlikely luck of finding a male defender willing to publicly embrace her unpopular cause. The triennial tithe was another elaborate mechanism of social protection established in the Mosaic Law. Every 3 years, the entire tithe of Israel's agricultural production didn't go to the central sanctuary, but was stored locally in the cities and villages themselves, to be distributed to the landless Levites, resident foreigners, helpless orphans, and needy widows. This system theoretically created a substantial community reserve for the most vulnerable segments of the population, but its real effectiveness depended entirely on two unpredictable factors: the honesty of contributors in actually setting aside the complete tithe, and the integrity of local administrators in actually distributing the resources to the correct recipients. In periods of prosperity and genuine piety, the system probably worked reasonably well. In periods of widespread corruption, prolonged drought, or political instability, these resources frequently didn't reach the widows who needed them most. The distance between written law and practiced law has always been the space where the vulnerable suffer most. Ancient Israel was no exception. It had laws genuinely advanced for its time, specifically designed to protect widows, orphans, and foreigners. It also had a society composed of fallible human beings who frequently ignored, circumvented, or openly violated these same laws when it was convenient, profitable, or simply easier. What the stories of these women reveal isn't just about a distant time and an ancient culture. It's about how any society in any era treats those who have no bargaining power, those whose daily suffering doesn't generate headlines or mobilize crowds, those who fundamentally depend on the voluntary goodwill of others to simply continue existing. The widows of the Old Testament were the first to feel when the community around them failed in its commitments, and they were the first to experience the difference when someone individually decided to act differently from the pattern. Some things change with the passage of centuries. Others just change a dress.